What's up everyone, my name is Teimojin and today we are talking about Alone Season 9 Episode 1. This is a recap, so if you haven't seen that episode, don't watch this. Bunch of spoilers and a lot of strategies and medical stuff that I'll be talking about. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm the doctor that was chosen to be on Season 9 of Alone. And what I wanted to try to do for you guys is a little series very similar to what Clay Hayes, winner of Season 8 of Alone, and Jordan Jonas, winner of Season 6 of Alone. They do these recaps where they go through play-by-play what has happened on the episode and their thoughts. So if you haven't seen Episode 1, do not watch this. Bunch of spoilers, and specifically based on what I see, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the medical side of our survival experience out there. So if that type of stuff interests you, please subscribe and click the notification button. It does help. I'm trying to grow this channel basically from not much, and I need your feedback to make better videos for you, both long form videos like this and YouTube shorts. So feel free to comment in the section what you want to know more about. I'll be diving into a few things briefly, and I can always make a dedicated video for whatever you want. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, Season 9 of Alone, Episode 1. This experience has been crazy. For those of you who follow my journey on Instagram, know that I'm a medical doctor working here in Ontario, trained in Michigan, former Army soldier in the Canadian Armed Forces, specialized in cold weather warfare. So that's my little shtick. That's where my niche is. But this experience was definitely something new. And it's been an honor to compete against 9 other amazing, very talented and skilled individuals. So I'm not in the spotlight for Episode 1. Check me out on Episode 2 this coming Thursday. But a lot of cool things happened in this first season, and you can kind of see how awesome the season's going to be. So what I'm doing for these series is I'm going through each participant one by one and telling you the things that I noticed and chiming in on the little medical perspectives here and there if applicable. So let's start with Karie Lee. Karie Lee is an absolute badass. She's the second oldest person who has ever tried to do this competition, and she is the oldest female to do this. For the most part, a lot of the contestants divide themselves in 2 initial strategies, one being scout and the other setting up a shelter fairly quickly. So Karie Lee decided to scout first, which I 100% agree with. You need to find your resources, see what kind of building materials you have, hunting ground, foraging opportunities, and trapping areas. And in addition to that, water sources. So Karie Lee scouts and she's able to take down game on day 2 of her journey. And one thing that I noticed and I really encourage is she plucked that bird. So the good thing about plucking the feathers is you maintain all of the skin, so you benefit from all the fat. Other fat sources are the spinal cord and the brain, and whatever fattiness is around the organs, but typically it's not a huge amount. So it's awesome that we got to see her pluck and cook the grouse. And fat in general is so important because after the starch is gone, after the blood sugar is gone, what we take is our emergency glucose from glycogen. That's typically in the liver and the muscles. So the glycogen is broken down to glucose, and that's what your system runs on for about 3 to 4 days, and then it goes on fats and proteins. So a lot of us try to gain as much weight as possible. So I think Karie Lee put on at least 30 pounds for this. If she is not supplementing with the fat, it kind of goes really fast because we're working super hard out there. So every little conservation of nutrients, specifically fats that we can have out there, is a plus. Next thing that we notice is it started to rain fairly quickly, and Karie Lee was able to set up a tarp, and it kind of looked like a C shape. I forget the exact word that she uses, but she kind of makes the top cave-like, and then on the bottom she puts it as a ground sheet. So that's super important because a lot of the spongy areas there, even though if you're covered on the top from the rain, a lot of it can kind of seep through the mosses and keep your stuff wet. So it's cool that she put that second barrier. One thing that I would caution is to make sure your lines are taut, because if they're not, what happens is the water can pool on the top, and in the middle of the night it can just kind of collapse into where you're sleeping, and that's a bunch of water. Now there are intentional kind of draining points that we see with Karie Lee and some of the other shelters that I'll talk about, but she does drain it and direct it into her pot. So you're not having to boil water or have to find water. And that's like an excellent choice of using the tarp that we are issued to protect our camera gear as our water source, which is super important. No calories spent on trying to make a fire or trying to find water. So super smart move. And then another thing, we don't get to see the exact location of Karie's shelter. She gets dropped off fairly high, like on a peak of a wee mountain or cliff. And one thing to note that you don't necessarily want to sleep on that top because you get pretty high winds at that location. And number two, if you're sleeping and cooking and doing all your things on a hill, a lot of that crosswind pushes a lot of your scent pretty far away so that you can be tracked by predators. And fun fact, if you're at the top of a hill, that's kind of where all that fire, if there was a forest fire, would try to go to. So if you're trying to avoid a fire, don't try to go up a hill because that's where all that fire, fuel, and wind is pushing. So you get trapped that way. I won't talk about every little thing, so if there's something that I missed or something you want to learn more about, please tell me in the comments. The last thing I want to talk about Karie Lee and some of the other contestants in episode 1 are the bug bites. So we see that they're getting a lot of bites on the neck, on the ears, and some on the arms as well. What can you do in that situation? So one interesting thing specifically for black flies is they love going around your neck. So one thing that you can do that's pretty simple, especially if you have a cap, is to have some kind of bandana or something that drapes over the back of your head. So just having that on the back reduces a substantial amount of bug bites, and you'd be surprised. Another tip, and I'm not sure how many people did this on their excursions on my season and past seasons, and this is something that we do in the military all the time. It's actually standard issue and we don't do it. The supplier for our equipment does it, is they soak everything in permethrin. Permethrin is kind of like a pesticide that is not noxious to us, but what it does is it affects the neurological system of bugs and it makes it so that they can't move or bite you. Soaking your clothes in permethrin prior to an excursion like this allows your clothes to act as a repellent. And if it gets close to you enough, and it's really nice to have collars like that, plus your cap, and then something that's draped on over the back that you can maybe tie in the front. If all that is soaked in permethrin, then that's a pretty good repellent, especially for ticks. But I would caution you, do not soak things like face towels or anything that's gonna go in mucous membranes, because that could be a little too sensitive for those areas. Next is my guy Benji. What a hunter. Now this guy does this full time in the middle of the bush, and he does guided hunting trips with pack goats, which is pretty freaking awesome. So when I first met Benji, it was very clear who had the best shot, and it was so precise and intentional of what he brought there in regards to hunting stuff and his bow and arrow setup, from the fletchings, from the arrow carrier, from his bow setup, from his arrow heads. Some of the few things that I learned from Benji, and something that I hope to show you as the series progresses, is how he kind of loads his arrows. So that's just one of the many things. So number one, Benji doesn't take his eye off his target, which is super hard, because when you're trying to knock something, you're trying to use your dexterity, the stress and adrenaline's going there, but he's able to knock his arrow without breaking eye contact from his prey. So he has the arrow in the front, overhand grip like this, and he takes his arrow either from the top, and I believe he has a bottom hole for his quiver too, and he takes that, puts it in front of him, and clicks it in like that, and then goes. So I thought that was a really cool thing when we were practicing in orientation camp that I learned. In addition to that, some modifications or just selection of his quiver was really cool. It was a very long quiver, so it covered the majority of the arrow, and what that does is it prevents it from weather damage, especially if you have turkey feather fletchings, which I did. It really protects those fletchings from moisture and gunk, so it doesn't affect the trajectory once it's out and firing. And it's really nice to have a hole that you can grab at the bottom. I believe Callie Russell from season 7 also had a back kind of opening for her quiver, so instead of going overhand like this, which may have a bigger implication on your movement and spooking the animal, or even if you're in a tight constrained area that can move branches and get caught and stuff. So instead there's a small movement where you're just reaching behind you, grabbing that arrow and knocking it. That was really cool. As we get further into the seasons, I'll talk about some of the arrowheads that was selected, because Benji had very intentional selections for his hunting equipment. For his fletchings, they were made out of plastic, so the water and moisture wouldn't really change the quality, and it was a little more durable. So in retrospect, that was probably the best idea. And for his arrow points, and what I learned about broadheads is the ones that are really reliable and that can be multifaceted are single bevel, kind of triangular shaped arrowheads, very easy to sharpen in the field too. I was finding during orientation while sharpening different arrowheads that the double bevel arrowheads where you sharpen on both sides were a little more difficult to sharpen, and you can only imagine how difficult it is in the field if you're just using a crude rock or a tiny file from your multi-tool. So Benji, we see him get a squirrel, excellent shot, and also 12 brook trout, which is amazing on the first day. He uses something called the Tenkara rod, and what I noticed was the wood that he used for his Tenkara rod. A Tenkara rod is basically an old Japanese style fishing rod system. So the typical commercial Tenkara rod is anywhere from 9 to 12 feet, and it's made out of fiberglass or some kind of flexy material, and it just connects to a string and a line. The thing that you want to know that is it has to have a decent amount of flex, and the whole purpose is to kind of just throw your bait to where you want to hit. And it's super important that everything's tapered from the wood that you use and your line. So it might be a floating line or a braided line to a monofilament and then to a leader. So it really acts like as a whip. And like a whip, it's kind of thicker at the base and it thins out. So the wood choice that Benji was looking at, I saw him poking at the tops of fallen spruce trees. Now this is an easy way to find very straight materials for a Tenkara rod, because at the very tip of these tall spruce trees are 9 feet plus of just straight stick, and all you have to do is very easily skin it. And when it's green, all that bark comes off really quickly. The only downside is it gets a little sticky. But if you kind of do that and just tie the string on the top, it is a very fast and straight way to get a Tenkara rod. And it was really cool to see how he was using the tidal influences in his location to get those trapped fishes. I'm sure a lot of you would want to make fishing traps over there and systems where you can trap fish. What you have to remember is that every season there are different regulations on how we can fish. So even though they're great ideas and a lot of us may have wanted to use them, it may not have necessarily been a possibility. I think Benji touches on so many cool aspects of survival, like salt, like fasting or rationing. And we see his experience puts him at risk for hypothermia. So typically in a lone, participants launch in the late summer, early fall. It's still above freezing temperature, but that doesn't mean you can't get hypothermia. With the weathers in Labrador where it switches so quickly and it's massive heavy rains, torrential rains, you can get pretty soaked pretty fast. And then if it's hard to find dry wood, then it'll be hard to dry out as well. So Benji goes out and scouts first, which a lot of us did out there, and then gets caught in a storm. Luckily, he has a lot of his rain gear on. It doesn't look like he kind of suffered at all, but again, he's a tough dude and it's pretty early in the season. Things that I would have done if I got completely soaked, let's say if I fell in the river, things that you want to do is differentiate mild / maybe a little moderate hypothermia to moderate severe. Now in previous seasons, we've seen pretty severe hypothermia, which is pretty dangerous. Things like confusion or imbalance or not talking properly, not making sense, walking around like a drunk person, that's your moderate to severe hypothermia. And the way you treat it is different than the mild to moderate or low moderate hypothermia, where you're cold, you're shivering, but you still have your full clear mentation. So that's the key thing to distinguish, mentation. If you want a dedicated video for hypothermia because it's such a huge topic, let me know in the comments. Let me know what questions you have about hypothermia, and we'll likely do it later when it starts to get colder. Number 2, Benji says he is going to eat everything that he catches to maintain his current body weight. And yeah, it is a two-pronged divergent tactic, right? We've seen people in the past who ration a lot, and we've seen people who eat and then go into a fast. So what's beneficial? Fasting has been something that has been used throughout history in indigenous communities all over the world. A lot of the time refrigeration's poor. Yes, you can smoke it, but if you spend time trying to ration everything, you risk spoiling some of that meat, especially with big game. So a lot of people eat as much as they can, smoke what they can or preserve what they can, and try to supplement each ration as a full meal until they don't have enough. And when they don't have enough to have their regular satiated meal, then they go on a fast. We know that your body you and me right now can survive on what we have on our frame, both the fats and the proteins, for upwards of 30 days. Now, the 30-40 days without food is kind of a marker that can change depending on how much fat and protein is in your system. And that day mark is kind of not an arbitrary marker, but a marker based on survival encounters. So if you're at day 30, don't think you're gonna die immediately. Know that it was based off of survival encounters of people without food. So if you feel like you can push yourself further, keep doing it, keep trying to get food and keep that hope alive. All that to say, I 100% agree with that strategy, eating as much as you can to maintain whatever you have right now to offset when that 30-day mark starts. Because after that, you lose about a pound a day. And if you want to learn more about starvation and refeeding and all that good stuff, check out my field guide at learnsurvivalmedicine.com or my website www.survivaldoctors.com to check out that 20+ page on starvation and eating. And lastly, salt. Salt is super important because we get dehydrated really fast. Imagine not eating or drinking anything for a day and then launching on an experience like this where you are carrying heavy stuff, trying to find your best location, hunting, foraging, and you're not necessarily drinking water immediately. So you lose water and you lose salt in your sweat. And for optimal performance at that get-go, when your survival priorities is right in your face, that salt really does help. The only caveat to this is that the salt that was brought in Himalayan salt, that is only sodium chloride. So if we learn from season 8 of Alone, where Biko was complaining of chest discomfort and then found to have a very low potassium, that is a salt that is not in Himalayan salt. So that's a big half of the problem. And low potassium can lead to not only fatal cardiac arrhythmias, but also a lot of muscle cramps and kidney issues as well. So stay tuned, subscribe, add that notification button because I will be talking about salt in depth. And a lot of those mysteries will be revealed once they show me using my emergency ration and I can talk more about it. So up next is Jessie, our other badass female contestant this season. And she is a former SEER instructor for the US military, now a very passionate wilderness living / survival instructor, specifically for women, which I think is phenomenal, and we need more people like her in the world. So like everyone that we've seen so far, we see Jessie scouting the area as well. A few things that really caught my eye was how she set up her tarp with that big pool of water. So that reservoir must be at least 10 liters. And she doesn't need to boil water, she doesn't need to treat it, she doesn't need to work for it. She's letting the rain work for her. So that's a really beautiful setup on how you can be covered from the rain and yet build a reservoir right next to your shelter. I think the most noticeable thing is that late night bear encounter. I would be scared shitless. For the first few days, we only have a tarp shelter. A bear can literally grab you from your feet while you're sleeping. And Jessie is just there chilling, talking to the camera very calmly, and it just goes to show you all that military training, all that calmness, reservedness, and she's ready to evaluate the situation and execute if needed. So really cool to see a sneak peek of the mental side of Jessie's endurance. Another thing that I really like that Jessie did is quite immediately, she evaluates the type of terrain we're in, and it looked heavily wooded, uneven ground, and the combination of slippery rocks, moss, and rain makes it so that the incidence of twisting your ankle or falling and hurting yourself incredibly high. And with all the camera gear, it's really hard to navigate while you're hunting, holding a camera, going through the bush. So it's really amazing that she decided to make a walking stick. And that walking stick, if the river was shallow enough and we could cross rivers, that walking stick could be used as an assistant, as a third leg to safely cross a river. And sometime this summer, I'm probably gonna make a video of me crossing a river safely with a walking stick, just like Jessie. One thing that I think might be really helpful for everyone is how to wrap their ankle with athletic tape, because one thing that I always carry in my first aid kit is athletic tape. It kind of looks like hockey tape except wider, and the adhesive is a lot stronger. Now if you twist your ankle and use athletic tape once the swelling goes down after that first acute period, it gives enough support and enough rigidity to make it feel like your ankle is 95% better. So a lot of the times I have a history of a sprained ankle and a loose ankle as well. So anytime I feel like it's getting a little unstable, I tape it and it feels like better than my good ankle. So it's a pretty useful skill to know how to wrap your ankle with athletic tape. And lastly, I think Jessie says it better than anyone. This isn't necessarily a survival challenge. This is a primitive living challenge because we are trying to live there. We're not trying to get out of that situation. So it'll be very interesting to see everyone this season make their area their home. Up next, we have a fellow Canadian, Juan Pablo, and he is such an impressive dude. If you look at his bio on the History Channel, you'll see that he's done 6 months expeditions, he's done 90-day expeditions backpacking, 100-day challenge in the boreal forest, basically in starvation mode the whole time. This guy knows his long-term survival, his long-term primitive living. So it's really cool to see him innovate new things, especially that stove. So the interesting thing about how he set up his stove is the air intake. It is such an important thing that he put that air intake that was the length of the stove on the bottom. Now it will make that stove so much more efficient, and putting that clay around it and surrounding it just makes it that much better for when that fire dies out in the night. All that thermal mass will keep the shelter warm if it's pretty airtight. And one thing that I saw that he did that was very similar to the rocket stoves that I've built in East Africa was he put an indentation for his pot on top and surrounded that indentation with clay so his pot can easily sit there. Now, in addition to having a nice place where there's no risk of slippage, that heated clay can also give a nice heating surface for that pot. One thing that I'm really curious about is the size of the stove though. Now, a stove about this big, that long, that tall. So with that size, I'm curious to see, is it enough to heat your shelter in the winter with that smaller stove setup? I definitely share Juan Pablo's appreciations for stoves, and I'm really excited to show you my stove setup later this season. And the last thing that I noticed that was a little peculiar is Juan Pablo's outlook on the situation. He expects the worst so that when he gets something, it seems a little bit better. Maybe it's just the way he said it, but it does have a negative connotation to it. And this is a little different from my personal approach to self-motivation and self-talk. I typically don't try to use any negative speech, and I do differentiate a negative outlook with an expectation of worse situations and hoping for the best. Because I do expect the worst, I hope for the best, but my outlook is trying to be as positive as possible. Because for me, I feel like that uplifts me instead of puts me in that negative space, because that can typically lead many people in a downward spiral. So really curious on how that perspective changes, or if it changes, and really curious to see how that affects his mental game further on in the season. And next we have Jacque, who kills it with getting a squirrel and a grouse pretty close together and dines on that meal. I'm not sure if he plucked the feathers or if he just took out the skin, but again, you want to keep as much skin as possible. People who are roasting their animals typically lose out on a lot of the spinal cord and marrow sometimes, especially with the smaller critters. When you boil all your stuff, all that fat stays in the pot. You can see the little bubbles of fat around the pot, and I'm sure a lot of people would lick that just to get that little ounce of fat left. And in addition to that, when you overboil something, things like skulls get easier and crunchier to eat. The ends of femurs on little squirrels and grouse get more easy to eat, and the bones are easier to break to access that marrow, that good nutrients in there. So highly recommend boiling all of your food, but for taste and crispiness and texture, sometimes a nice grill or a smoke is worth the treat. The one thing that I'm super jealous about Jacque is he finds a trap. Now it was really interesting because I was reading some of the comments from Jordan's and Clay's recaps, and there was one guy who said that that trap actually belongs to his friend in Labrador, and what he does is he leaves them unopened in the summertime, and then when the fall and winter comes, he comes there in that trail and opens it up to trap small game. So that is perfect for beavers, perfect for foxes and those small critters. So I'm really excited to see if he catches something with that, because that's such a big find. And to catch a porcupine or a beaver with all that fat and juiciness, man, really jealous of that. And the last thing that I noticed about Jacque's experience on episode 1 was the hunger pains. Now this thing is really uncomfortable, and I think the hardest part is when your body transitions between regular glucose in your blood to a ketosis state. You really feel run down when this happens. And this typically happens when there's no more glucose, no more glycogen in your body, and then you are eating less than 50 carbs a day. And then you typically go to ketosis. Your breath may smell different. You may have a different taste in your mouth. You will feel really drained, like you just ran a marathon. But one thing that you can do is hydrate up. Make sure at least your blood volume's adequate so you can feel like you can push a little bit. And then after a week or so, your body kind of compensates and gets used to running mostly on fat and protein. We are going in with with big stomachs, a lot of us were gorging as much as we could to gain as much weight as possible. So your stomachs are huge. And then when we go into this experience over time, it kind of shrinks. And that first transition to shrinkage, in addition to having no food, really is uncomfortable. You can supplement that with just warm water to have something in your system, have a little bit of teas, roots, foraging as much as possible. Just like 3 or 4 handfuls of berries really fills you up, so that helps with those hunger pains. And then also supplementing fibers in there also helps a great deal with keeping something in your belly so that acid isn't eating away at your stomach and causing that irritation. And last but not least, Igor. Igor is a giant of a man. I can't even pull his bow because of how tall he is. Like, it's basically as tall as I am. Yeah, I remember talking to Igor going into this, and like everyone, he gained a lot of weight, but at the same time, he is 6 foot something, and that's a lot of protein, a lot of mass to move around. So I think for him, scouting, that was a very interesting kind of cost and effect, because at one point, just like everyone else, we're trying to find the best resources and the best location. He has more to fill in his tank, because per mile that he walks or kilometer that he walks, the amount of calorie that he expends versus how much I or Karie Lee would expend is completely different. He was probably in a decent amount of caloric deficit by that day 3, and which goes to discuss BMR, so basic metabolic rate. Now, typically a lot of books say like 2000 is what your daily intake is, but in a lot of these conditions, and especially for athletes, it's way more than that. To get an idea, just a rough estimate of how much we need on a regular basis just to maintain performance, do 57 times your weight in kilograms and you get an estimate. Mine is around like 4,000 something. So 4,000 kilocalories. That's a lot, you know, when we think about fat squirrels in like the suburbs, which may have 400 to 500 kilocalories. I still have a hard time believing that. It's crazy to think that we need like 10 of those to maintain our weight and to maintain our optimal performance. Obviously, a lot of us will lose weight throughout this, but depending on your weight, the more muscle you have, the more you lose, because you need to power those muscles, you need to feed those muscles. And one thing that is a very fine balance is having a lot of fat and little muscles to having a lot of fat and not enough muscles, because you do need enough muscles to move that frame, or else you're just increasing your risk of injury. And we'll learn later on in the season that you do need more muscles to reduce how steep of a curve you decline after your fat stores are gone. But it looks like Igor is one of the closest to the sea, so he gets outwashing of some of the seaweeds, which has iodine in it, and hopefully some salt to replenish how he feels when he's doing that, because I imagine with someone with that amount of mass to move, doing all these activities in what seems a little bit more of a warmer climate, he's going to lose a lot of salt, and that's going to make him cramp up and probably not feel the best, like anyone of his size would feel in that situation. In his clips, we did see some evidence of seals in that area, so I'm really excited to see if he's able to bag one. And in addition to that, we see little outlets of streams going into the big river. So for those of you who don't know a whole lot about fly fishing or fishing in general, those transition zones between Y junctions, river and an outlet, those are some good places to start looking for fish and looking for structures in the water, like steep drop-offs or big boulders in there where fish can hide. You want to think like a fish. They are trying to do the least amount of work with the highest volume of that conveyor belt of food. So typically home is in the foam. So when you see that foam line, typically in the early mornings and in the evenings, you can kind of see where those bubbles are, and then try to make a mental note of where these transition points are to place those flies and baits there to get that fish. And one parting tip that I learned just before launching is that the steepness of the hill on the bank of the river kind of foreshadows how steep the drop is into the river. So if you are by the river and it's pretty steep, imagine that there should be some steepness to the river right coming off of that cliff. So that depth may be a good thing to look for when the water gets colder. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed some of that. If there's something that I missed, and I'm sure I missed a few things, mention it in the comments and I'll touch base about it on the episode 2 recap or a dedicated additional video. If you find value to this, please subscribe and click the notification button. We are trying to turn this experience, many of us, into our full-time job. I would love to teach survival medicine full-time, and to do that, I need your support, I need your guidance, and I need you to tell me what you want to learn so I can make specific content for you. And if you want to learn more, as always, check out learnsurvivalmedicine.com or check out the resources at www.survivaldoctors.com. And this is Dr. Tan signing out. I'll see you next time.